There is a number that keeps coming up when you talk to people who actually move aircraft for a living, not the people writing press releases, not the people running booths at air shows, but the ones sitting across the desk from buyers who were supposed to sign last month and didn't. That number is somewhere between 18 and 30%. Depending on who you ask and which category they're working in, that's roughly how much certain models of general aviation aircraft have softened in real transactional value over the last 24 to 36 months. Not asking price, not list price, not what the brochure says, but what the airplane actually changes hands for when the paperwork gets signed and the wire hits. And the thing is, that number doesn't surprise anyone who's been paying attention to the signals underneath the market. What surprises people is how fast it happened, and more importantly, how unevenly it happened across different aircraft types, because this is not a story where everything dropped equally. Some categories have held up remarkably well. Others are falling in ways that feel uncomfortably familiar to anyone who was around for the last time an asset class went through a violent repricing event. Today we are going to walk through exactly which aircraft values are crashing hardest, why different models are dropping at different speeds and for different reasons, and what you actually do with that information, whether you're a buyer, a seller, or someone sitting on a fleet decision right now wondering whether to hold or move. Before we get into it, hit subscribe, because this channel covers the financial mechanics of general aviation in a way that most aviation content doesn't go near. And if you want to understand where aircraft values are actually headed, instead of what the sales industry wants you to believe, you need to be here for everything that's coming next. Let's start with the honest version of why this is happening, because the comfortable explanation and the accurate explanation are two different things, and you deserve the accurate one. The comfortable explanation is that interest rates went up, buyers got cautious, and everything slowed down a little. That's true as far as it goes, but it doesn't explain why a 20-year-old piston single with 800 hours on a fresh engine is holding value better right now than a 5-year-old turboprop that cost $1 million new. It doesn't explain why certain light twins have fallen off a cliff while certain single-engine high performers are still moving quickly at strong numbers. It doesn't explain why airplanes in some geographic markets are taking 4 months to sell, while nearly identical airplanes in other markets are gone in 3 weeks. The interest rate story is real, but it's a backdrop. The actual story is more granular and considerably more interesting. What's actually happening is that multiple independent pressure systems all arrived at roughly the same moment, and they are not hitting every category of aircraft the same way. You have a financing cost problem, you have an insurance availability problem, you have a demographic problem that is reshaping who the buyer pool actually is. You have a technology disruption problem, you have a fuel availability problem, you have a certification cost problem on the new side that is bleeding into the used side's relative value equation. You have a regulatory shift that just rewired the access economics for an entire segment of the market. And you have the residue of a pandemic-era buying frenzy that pulled forward an enormous amount of demand and left behind a used inventory pool that is now far richer, far newer, and far more competitively priced than anyone in manufacturing had planned for. All of those things are happening simultaneously, and depending on which combination of them applies to a specific aircraft category, you get very different outcomes. Some airplanes are down 15%, some are down 30%, some have actually held. And the difference between those outcomes has almost nothing to do with which airplane is nicer or better built or more capable. It has everything to do with which specific combination of pressures is hitting that category, and how the buyer math works out at that price point under current conditions. So let's go through this category by category, because that's the only way to actually understand it. And let's be specific, because vague is useless when you're trying to make a real decision with real money. The first place values are dropping hardest, and frankly the most predictable place once you understand the mechanics, is the high-time piston twin segment. We are talking about cabin-class twins, light twins, the kind of airplanes that were built for serious cross-country personal transportation back when owning a twin was the aspiration that a successful dentist or a regional business owner worked toward for years. These airplanes are getting hit from every direction at once, and it is not subtle. Start with the insurance picture, because that is the issue that is actively removing buyers from the pool rather than just making them hesitate. Underwriting for piston twins has gotten genuinely difficult in ways that go beyond the ordinary cost increase. Some of the major players in general aviation insurance have pulled back meaningfully from piston twin coverage, specifically for owner pilots who don't have recent twin time in their logbook. And recent means something very specific. in a way that changes the math for a large share of the potential buyer pool. We're talking about buyers who flew twins 10 or 15 years ago, stepped away from it, built successful careers, accumulated enough money to afford a serious airplane again, and are now coming back to the market expecting to pick up where they left off. What they're finding instead is that their 10-year-old twin time doesn't satisfy current underwriting requirements, that qualifying for coverage requires a meaningful block of dual instruction and sometimes a monitored solo period before they can get a policy at all, and that even after clearing those hurdles, the annual premium on a cabin-class piston twin can be startling relative to what the airplane is worth in the current market. When insurance cost as a percentage of aircraft value gets to a certain threshold, it starts showing up in the purchase decision in a way that pure purchase price doesn't, because the purchase price is a one-time number that you can finance and spread out. But the insurance premium is an annual recurring cost that you are paying whether the airplane flies or sits in the hangar. Buyers who run that math honestly are increasingly finding that the operating cost of a twin at current insurance rates, layered on top of the double-engine maintenance program, the twin-specific hangar usually required, and the fuel burn, puts the all-in hourly cost at a number that is very hard to justify for the actual transportation mission most of these buyers are flying. And the natural response to that math is to either step down to a capable single, which insures more cheaply and costs less to run, or step up to a turboprop or fractional program, where the economics of professional crew management start to make sense. The twin sits in the middle of that equation and is increasingly losing the argument on both sides, which is exactly why values are falling. Layer on top of the insurance problem the demographic reality of who has historically owned these airplanes. The twin-engine piston market has always skewed toward buyers who are established, experienced, and generally speaking a bit further along in their careers and their flying lives than the buyer for a basic four-seat piston single. That demographic skew means the seller side of this market is extraordinarily active right now, because the medical certificate situation, the insurance age bracket pricing structure, and the general reality of people reaching a point in life where maintaining an instrument rating and staying current in a high-performance twin starts to feel like a job rather than a pleasure, all of that is pushing a wave of twins onto the market at the same time. Supply is up, the buyer pool is narrowing. That is a value equation with a predictable outcome, and we are seeing it play out in real time. There is also a third pressure on this specific segment that almost never gets talked about directly, which is that the useful load story on a lot of these older twins is genuinely compromised in ways that buyers only discover after they've fallen in love with the airplane. Take a twin from the 1980s or early 1990s that's been properly equipped with modern avionics, good radios, a traffic system, a weather data link, an autopilot that actually works the way a modern autopilot should work. Each of those upgrades added weight. Not catastrophic weight, but real weight, and on an airframe that was designed with useful load margins that already weren't generous by modern standards. Several hundred pounds of avionics upgrades can leave you in a position where full fuel and 2 adults with luggage has you looking very carefully at your numbers before every departure. Buyers who discover this on a demo flight are not charmed. They start asking hard questions about why they would pay a premium for a complex airplane that can't actually carry what they need to carry on the trips they're actually planning to take. And the honest answer to that question is frequently that they shouldn't, which is not a conclusion that moves airplanes off the market. The second category dropping hard, and the one generating the most surprise among people who've been watching this market for a long time, is the 20 to 30-year-old glass panel retrofit piston single. These were the airplanes that hit a sweet spot during the pandemic, buying years almost perfectly. Old enough to be affordable relative to new, young enough to have gone through a comprehensive avionics upgrade, low enough time on the engine to have real life remaining, and outfitted with the panel technology that buyers who learned to fly on Garmin glass simply refused to do without. That combination produced strong prices and genuinely fast sales through most of the early 2020s, and a lot of buyers, investors, and fleet operators made confident purchase decisions based on the assumption that the retrofit glass premium was structural and durable. Here is what happened instead. The used market got flooded with inventory from the pandemic-era buying surge as buyers who paid peak prices realized they had overpaid for their mission, as flying hours softened when the novelty wore off, and as the reality of what it costs to own and maintain a 30-year-old airframe on a modern budget started arriving in the form of annual inspection surprises and AD compliance costs that nobody budgeted for honestly. A lot of those airplanes came back onto the market within 18 to 36 months of purchase, which is a very short ownership cycle, and they came back into a used market that was simultaneously receiving inventory from the normal flow of buyers, stepping up, stepping down, or stepping out of aviation entirely. The result was a rapid increase in the availability of exactly the kind of retrofitted piston singles that had commanded a premium during the buying frenzy. And when supply of a desirable thing increases faster than the pool of buyers who want it, the price conversation changes fast. What makes this category particularly interesting is that the glass panel itself, the thing that justified the premium in the first place, is now actually working against resale value in some cases. Avionics technology has continued to advance, and a Garmin stack that was genuinely impressive 5 or 6 years ago is starting to look dated in ways that buyers who are shopping against current new airplane equipment standards are noticing. An older retrofit with a first-generation glass suite is now competing against newer airplanes with weather avoidance built into the panel, synthetic vision as standard, traffic integration that doesn't require a separate box, and autopilots with envelope protection and coupled approaches that actually work reliably without a long list of known issues. Buyers who got into aviation during the glass revolution are now finicky about what generation of glass they're getting, and an airplane retrofitted 8 years ago, with hardware that was excellent then, but is now 1 or 2 generations behind, can actually trade at a discount to an honest round-dial airplane of similar vintage, because at least the round-dial airplane doesn't mislead a buyer about what they're actually getting. That's a nuance that's worth understanding if you're trying to figure out what your specific retrofitted airplane is actually worth in the current market. Because not all glass is equal, and buyers are increasingly sophisticated about the difference. The third category, and one that is frankly in free fall in a way that requires some careful explanation because the numbers are genuinely ugly, is the light jet that was purchased at peak prices between 2020 and early 2023. This is not a simple story about interest rates. This is a story about a category that went through one of the most dramatic value distortions in general aviation history during the fractional and charter demand surge of the pandemic years, and is now unwinding that distortion in a way that is painful for owners who bought at the top. During the period when commercial aviation was disrupted, when high net worth travelers were discovering personal aviation as an alternative to dealing with airports, and when charter demand was so intense that operators were paying premium prices for any turbine-capable airframe they could find, light jets that would have ordinarily traded in a fairly narrow band around a well-established market value got bid up to numbers that reflected genuine scarcity in a frenzied market rather than fundamental long-term value. A 10-year-old Citation that had a reasonable market value in the high hundreds of thousands before the pandemic got sold at $1.3 million, $1.5 million, in some cases more, to operators who needed the capacity and were willing to pay whatever it took to get it. Those prices bore very little relationship to what the airplane was worth, based on its actual attributes: its engine time remaining, its maintenance status, its useful life, its operating cost profile. They reflected a temporary supply-demand imbalance in a specific moment in time, and the buyers who paid those prices in some cases understood that and built their business model around a utilization rate that would make the economics work. As commercial aviation normalized, as charter demand came off its peak, and as utilization assumptions that underpinned those purchase decisions proved optimistic, those operators and investors have been looking for the exit, and the light jets they paid peak prices for are hitting the market in volume, against a buyer pool that is now shopping at something much closer to pre-pandemic fundamental value, rather than the distorted prices of the frenzy years. The gap between what was paid and what the airplane actually sells for today in some of these categories is large enough that it makes the 2008 car analogy in the title of this video feel like understatement rather than hyperbole. It's worth pausing on that analogy for a moment because it is actually quite precise in a specific way that the casual version of it might miss. What happened to certain car values in 2008, specifically to luxury performance vehicles and trucks bought at bubble prices during the easy credit years, wasn't that the cars stopped being capable or desirable. It was that the financing environment that had inflated the purchase prices dried up faster than anyone expected, and the asset values that had been supported by cheap, abundant credit had to find their real floor very quickly when that credit disappeared. The cars didn't change, the money changed, and the people who were caught holding expensive assets bought with expensive credit when the market turned found out very fast what the floor actually was. General aviation light jets in 2024 and 2025 are going through a structurally similar thing, with one additional twist that makes it worse in some cases than the car analogy suggests. A car that depreciated badly in 2008 still worked. It still started, it still drove, it still got you where you needed to go. A light jet whose value has dropped 30 or 40%, but whose engine overhaul reserve keeps accumulating, whose avionics subscription fees keep running, whose hangar keeps costing what it costs, and whose insurance keeps repricing at renewal, is an asset that is losing value on paper and generating costs in reality simultaneously. The all-in financial experience of holding a light jet that you bought at peak prices is considerably more painful than a spreadsheet that just shows depreciation would suggest. And the owners who are most motivated to sell are selling hard into a market that is bidding cautiously. That is a recipe for discovering where the actual floor is, and in several specific makes and models, we are still in the process of finding it. The fourth category showing significant value erosion, and the one that surprises people who haven't been watching this specific corner of the market carefully, is the high-performance piston single, with significant engine time remaining, on a major overhaul that happened at the wrong moment. This one requires some unpacking, because it's subtle, in a way that the twin and light jet stories aren't. A piston single with 200 hours remaining on a run-out engine and a market price that reflects that time is a reasonably uncomplicated value proposition. You know what you're getting, you know what the overhaul is going to cost, you can price the airplane accordingly, and buyers can underwrite that math. Where things get complicated is the airplane that went through an expensive top end, or even a major overhaul 2 or 3 years ago, and now has a lot of fresh time on the engine, but was overhauled right as material costs, labor costs, and shop lead times all surged dramatically. The owner who paid $40,000 or $45,000 for an engine overhaul in 2021 or 2022, when shops were backed up and charging accordingly, and who is now trying to recapture some of that investment in the asking price, is discovering that buyers are doing the math differently than the seller is. The buyer looks at a fresh engine with several hundred hours on it and thinks, "Great, that's an asset." But what matters to them is what that engine will cost to overhaul when it gets to TBO, and the answer to that question has softened somewhat from the absolute peak of the supply chain disruption era, because some of the extraordinary shop premium that was being charged during the backlog years has eased. The seller paid the peak price and built that into their value expectation. The buyer is pricing forward to a future overhaul cost that is somewhat lower than what the seller paid, and that mismatch between what the overhaul cost and what the overhaul will be worth at resale is creating a pricing gap that is genuinely hard to bridge. In categories where that gap is wide enough, the airplane either sits or sells below what the math seemed to suggest it should, and sellers who are surprised by that outcome haven't done the forward-looking math the way buyers are doing it. There's a fifth category in significant trouble that is not a mechanical story at all. It is a pure demographic and motivation story. This is the segment of well-maintained, nicely equipped, genuinely excellent older airplanes that have been owned by the same person for a long time and are now coming to market because the owner is exiting aviation, not because the airplane is ready to be retired. We are in the middle of a generational transition in general aviation ownership that is genuinely unprecedented in scale, and the selling pressure it is creating in certain categories is real, sustained, and not going to resolve quickly. The pilot who has owned the same Cherokee or Bonanza or Cessna 210 for 15, 18, 20 years and is now in their early 70s and has decided it is time to let the medical certificate go, let the instrument currency lapse, and hand the airplane off to someone younger, that pilot represents an enormous pool of sellers right now. Not one or two or even 100. Thousands of them are having that conversation at the same time, driven by the same demographic wave, and the airplanes they are putting on the market are not broken or neglected. They are frequently very well maintained by people who love them, which makes them genuinely attractive to buyers, but there are so many of them coming to market in the same window that even genuine buyer interest cannot absorb the supply without prices softening. What makes this segment particularly interesting from a value perspective is that the airplanes themselves didn't change. A well-maintained Bonanza A36 from the mid-1990s with a fresh engine and good avionics is the same useful, capable, flexible airplane it has always been. But when 50 of them are on the market at the same time instead of 15, because a generation of owners is retiring simultaneously, the buyer who's interested has options. And a buyer with options negotiates differently than a buyer who found the only one on the market that checks their boxes. The depreciation showing up in this segment is not a quality story, it is a supply story, and it is going to persist until either the supply wave works its way through or a new generation of buyers steps up in numbers large enough to absorb it. Both of those things will happen eventually. They haven't happened yet. The sixth category dropping in value, and the one generating some of the most passionate disagreement when you raise it with people who love this type of airplane, is the vintage tailwheel that was bid up dramatically during the pandemic era by buyers who had never owned one before and didn't fully understand what ownership of a 70-year-old certificated airframe actually requires. There was a genuinely beautiful moment a few years back where the combination of pandemic wanderlust, increased aviation interest, backcountry flying content exploding on social platforms, and money that was cheap and plentiful conspired to create runaway demand for vintage tail draggers in a way that the market had never really seen. Cubs, Chiefs, Champs, Luscombes, Ercoups, and their kin got bid to prices that genuinely surprised longtime owners and dealers who had been buying and selling these airplanes for years at prices that had been remarkably stable for a very long time. A Piper Cub that had traded in the low 30s for years was suddenly at $60,000, $70,000, $80,000. A Cessna 140 that had been a $15,000 airplane was at $30,000. Across the whole segment, prices effectively doubled in some cases over a period of 18 to 24 months, driven by buyers who wanted an airplane and wanted one now and were willing to pay whatever it took. Here is what those buyers discovered after they got home with their purchases. A 70-year-old fabric airplane is not a maintenance-light ownership experience. Annual inspections on vintage tail draggers run significantly higher at shops that actually know what they're looking at, because the shops that know what they're looking at charge accordingly for their expertise, and the ones that don't know what they're looking at are a risk you don't want to take with a certificated antique. Parts availability is a real issue for some of these airframes in ways that buyers who hadn't owned one before didn't fully appreciate when they were bidding. Storage and hangar requirements are less forgiving of the cheap T-hanger solution that works fine for a more modern airplane. And the learning curve on actually flying a tailwheel airplane well, particularly for buyers who came from the tricycle gear world, is steeper and more demanding of recurrent training than some buyers expected when they handed over the wire. Attrition in this segment has been real, and the owners who paid peak prices discovered what ownership actually required and are now putting their airplanes back on the market, are doing so into a used market that is much better stocked with these airplanes than it was during the buying frenzy, and at asking prices that have to compete with sellers who paid far less and can afford to be priced more realistically. The depreciation story here isn't as catastrophic as the light jet situation, but it's meaningful. And for someone who paid $80,000 for a Cub in 2021, discovering that the honest market for that airplane has returned to something in the high 40s or 50s is a real and painful number, not an abstract percentage. The seventh category, and arguably the most structurally complicated one on this entire list, because the reasons for the value decline are deeply interwoven with regulatory and insurance factors that operate independently of each other, is the older pressurized piston single. The Cessna P210, the Piper Malibu, and similar airframes occupy a genuinely interesting place in the market because they offer capabilities that are not easy to replicate at anywhere near their price points, and they've been the workhorse personal transportation airplane for a generation of pilots who needed to get high enough to stay out of weather and fast enough to make the trip worthwhile. These airplanes have served that mission well for a long time. They're now in a very difficult place in the current market for reasons that stack badly on each other. Start with insurance. Underwriting a pressurized piston complex single for an owner pilot has become one of the more painful conversations in general aviation insurance right now. The accident record for these specific airframes, particularly in weather-related incidents and pressurization-related emergencies, has given underwriters genuine statistical reasons to be cautious, and the caution is manifesting in annual premiums that can run to 10 or 15% of the airplane's current market value on older examples. When your annual insurance bill is $15,000 on a $100,000 airplane, the ownership math starts to look very different than it did when premiums were a more modest fraction of value and the airplane itself was worth twice the current market price. Layer on top of the insurance problem the maintenance reality of a pressurized airframe that is now 40 to 45 years old and is carrying all of the system's complexity that pressurization requires, specifically the pressurization system itself, which is not cheap to maintain and is not something every shop is equipped and certified to work on correctly. The door seals, the pressurization controller, the outflow valve, the turbocharging system that delivers the manifold pressure required to push the airplane to altitudes where pressurization matters. All of those systems add meaningful annual maintenance costs beyond what an unpressurized airplane of similar vintage would require. And because the airframe is old enough that corrosion inspection and structural compliance work is a real part of every annual, the total annual inspection cost on one of these can be genuinely alarming the first time it hits. None of that was different 5 years ago. What's different now is that the insurance problem has gotten significantly worse at the same time the purchase price has softened, creating a situation where the insurance cost as a percentage of value has moved to a genuinely hard-to-justify level, and buyers who understand that math are walking. Sellers who paid more than current market and built their asking price around recovering that investment are discovering that buyers have options in the pressurized personal transportation space at other price points, and the negotiating leverage is entirely on the buy side right now. The eighth category, and a story that has both good and difficult dimensions depending on where you sit in the transaction, is the turboprop that went through a prop strike event at some point in its history and was repaired to airworthy standards, but carries that entry in the logbook. We are not talking about an airframe that was inadequately repaired or that presents any actual operational safety concern. We are talking about an airplane that was hit by something, or hit something, had a mandatory disassembly and inspection, had parts replaced that needed to be replaced, was returned to service by an appropriately certificated shop, and carries the documentation of that process in its records in the way it is supposed to. The market is treating these airplanes as if the logbook entry itself is a permanent value impairment, regardless of the quality or completeness of the repair, and the discount applied to a prop strike history airplane versus a comparable airframe with no such history has gotten considerably larger in the current market than it was 5 years ago. Some of that is rational, because insurance companies have gotten pickier about prop strike history aircraft, and the conversation with an underwriter about one of these airplanes is meaningfully more complex than a clean logbook airplane of the same make and model, which adds a real practical obstacle for buyers. Some of it is irrational, because a properly documented and repaired prop strike on a well-maintained turboprop is a known event with a known outcome, which is actually a better transparency picture than an airplane that has never had a documented prop strike, but has also never had the associated inspection. But the market does not always behave rationally, and right now the market is being rationally cautious about insurance friction and irrationally discounting based on logbook perception, and the result is that sellers with prop strike history airplanes are either holding long or pricing to a discount that reflects the real friction in finding a buyer who can get the insurance conversation to close. The ninth category dropping in value, and the one with perhaps the most interesting forward-looking implication of anything on this list, is the mid-time turbine helicopter in the personal and light commercial weight class. I want to be careful here because rotorcraft is its own world, with its own economics and its own buyer dynamics. But the value story happening in certain helicopter categories right now is significant enough that it belongs in this conversation, and the reasons for it are instructive in ways that connect directly to what's happening on the fixed-wing side. What you're seeing in the mid-time light turbine helicopter segment specifically is the collision of several things at once. The personal and light charter market that drove demand in this category has softened as the general cost of turbine ownership, insurance, and regulatory compliance has increased. The cost of reaching the mandatory overhaul milestones on the dynamic components of a turbine helicopter, main rotor head, tail rotor assembly, transmission, gearboxes, is very large as a fraction of airframe value on older airframes that have been through multiple overhaul cycles, and buyers are increasingly sophisticated about doing the math on what happens to their ownership cost when the dynamic component calendar is running. Add to that the specific insurance pressure around helicopter operations generally, which has gotten tighter even faster than fixed-wing GA insurance in some segments, due to accident experience. And you have a market where qualified, interested buyers are walking away not because the helicopter isn't capable, but because the full financial picture of owning it at current cost levels doesn't compute at the asking price. What this means for values going forward is that the correction in this segment still has room to run. The sellers who are most motivated are the operators who built business models around utilization assumptions that are no longer realistic and need to exit their positions in order to stop the financial bleeding. Those sellers have a strong incentive to transact at prices that are genuinely painful for them, because the cost of holding and not transacting is worse than the cost of selling at a discount. That dynamic, Motivated sellers with real carrying costs competing against cautious buyers is where large and fast price corrections happen, and it is exactly the dynamic driving the worst of the value erosion across multiple segments of the market right now. The 10th category in significant trouble, and the one that is generating the least public discussion despite having some of the most significant ownership and value implications of anything we've covered, is the large cabin piston single that is aging out of the rental and training ecosystem and landing on the private market in volume. Think about what happens to an airplane that spent 15 years in a flight training fleet or a rental operation. It flew constantly. It was maintained to minimum airworthy standards rather than optimal standards, because the economics of a training fleet don't support spending on anything that isn't directly required. It accumulated hours faster than most privately owned airplanes do, and the interior and cosmetic condition reflects the reality of rotating student pilots rather than a single careful owner. These airplanes, when they age out of rental operations or when a flight school restructures its fleet, enter the private market at price points that are artificially low, because the seller is a business that needs to move assets off the books, not a private individual who has sentimental attachment and a high asking price. On its own, that's not a crisis for the category's values. Flight school exits have always happened, and the airplanes have always absorbed into the private market eventually. What's different now is the volume and the timing. The combination of flight school consolidation, the shift toward newer training fleets in the large corporate flight school segment, and the genuine financial difficulty some smaller independent flight schools are experiencing in the current environment has put more of these airplanes on the market in a compressed window than the private buyer ecosystem can smoothly absorb. High-hour, well-worn 172s and Pipers are sitting longer than they would in a balanced market, and their presence in the inventory at relatively low asking prices is dragging the value conversation on cleaner examples of the same types downward, because buyers who aren't sophisticated enough to accurately distinguish between a former training fleet airplane and a private owner airplane often don't know why one should cost significantly more than the other, and sellers of the nicer examples are finding they have to justify the premium in a way they never used to. So now that we've walked through all of this, the question that actually matters is what you do with it. And the answer is genuinely different depending on which side of the transaction you're on. If you are a buyer right now, this is one of the more interesting windows the general aviation used market has created in a very long time. But interesting doesn't mean uncomplicated, and it absolutely does not mean that you should simply go buy the cheapest thing in the category that's been sitting longest and assume you got a deal. The reason some of these airplanes are sitting is because there's something wrong with the category's value proposition at current conditions, and buying into a category because the price has fallen without understanding why the price has fallen is how people end up with an airplane that continues declining in value after they buy it. What this window actually offers a sophisticated buyer is access to genuinely good airplanes in categories where the price pressure is supply-driven and demographic rather than quality-driven. The large, well-maintained piston single coming off a careful private owner who's aging out of flying is an airplane that has every attribute a buyer should want. In a market where supply is temporarily high and prices reflect that temporary supply rather than anything wrong with the airplane itself. The older but carefully maintained pressurized single, sold by an owner who understands what it costs to maintain it properly and has actually done that, at a price discounted to reflect the current insurance friction, is an airplane where a buyer who does the insurance conversation correctly before the purchase rather than after can potentially find genuine value. The cabin class twin, priced to reflect the realistic buyer pool rather than what it would have sold for 4 years ago, in the hands of a buyer who has the twin time to insure it cleanly and the discipline to run the operating cost numbers honestly, is an airplane that can still represent excellent value for the right mission. The discipline required is to understand which category the aircraft you're looking at falls into, why its price is where it is specifically, and whether the reason for the discount is one you can work around or one that is going to follow you through the ownership experience. An airplane that's cheap, because there are a lot of examples on the market right now, is very different from an airplane that's cheap because the insurance underwriters have decided the category is fundamentally problematic. The first situation is a buyer's market that you can exploit with good timing. The second is a signal about a cost structure that is going to be part of your life as long as you own the airplane. The specific research you should do before committing to any purchase in the current market is genuinely more extensive than it needed to be 4 or 5 years ago, and not doing it is how expensive mistakes happen. Before you fall in love with a specific airplane and before you start negotiating price seriously, Call an aviation insurance broker who is not affiliated with the seller and tell them exactly what airplane you're considering, with its specific serial number, its logbook history as best you know it, and your actual pilot experience in accurate, specific terms. Ask for a real quote for the coverage you actually need, not a rough estimate. Do this before you have an emotional investment in the outcome, because finding out after a purchase agreement is signed that the insurance picture is dramatically different from what you assumed is one of the more painful and expensive discoveries in personal aviation. If the airplane you're looking at has any logbook history items that could be insurance relevant, which means prop strike history, accident history, specific modifications, operational history in certain categories of commercial operation, make those disclosures in your insurance conversation and get a real underwriting response before you assume coverage is available at a reasonable price. Insurance friction that you discover late in the transaction doesn't just cost you money, it can collapse a deal that you've already spent significant time and resources pursuing. Beyond insurance, a thorough pre-purchase inspection by an IA who is genuinely independent of the seller, has specific experience with the make and model you're considering, and has been given full access to the airframe, the engine records, the logbook, and the airframe log with no restrictions, is not optional right now. It was never really optional, but in the current market where some of the inventory sitting longest has been sitting for reasons that aren't immediately obvious from the listing photos and the asking price, the pre-purchase is your primary protection against acquiring a problem you didn't know you were buying. A good pre-purchase will cost you real money. It will occasionally tell you things you don't want to hear about an airplane you've already gotten excited about. Those are both features, not bugs. If you are a seller in the current market, the honest advice is uncomfortable but straightforward. The buyers who are actively purchasing right now are, on average, more financially sophisticated, more research capable, and more willing to walk away from a deal that doesn't work for them than the buyers who were competing for the same limited inventory during the peak years. You cannot rely on a bidding war to get you to a price that makes your ownership experience feel validated. The market does not care what you paid, it does not care what you need, and it is increasingly well informed about what your specific airplane is worth, based on comparable sales that are easily accessible to any buyer with an internet connection and an hour of time. That doesn't mean you have to give your airplane away. It means that pricing honestly, relative to current market comparables, being completely transparent about the airplane's history in a way that builds buyer confidence, rather than leaving them to discover things through a pre-purchase, and working with a broker or dealer who has current active market knowledge in your specific category, rather than using a valuation guide that's 6 months out of date, is how you get to a transaction in a reasonable time frame at a price that works for both sides. The sellers who are going to sit the longest in the current market are the ones who priced based on what they paid, what they spent on upgrades, or what the market was 2 years ago, rather than what it is today. Every month an airplane sits on the market costs money in fixed ownership expenses, and more importantly, every month it sits is a month where comparable examples that your airplane is competing against are being sold at prices that set the reference point for the next buyer who comes along. Sitting at an unrealistic price doesn't preserve your asking price over time, it just delays the transaction, while the market information that buyers are working from gets increasingly precise, and that precision almost never benefits a seller holding firm at an above-market number. There is a broader implication in all of this that is worth sitting with before we wrap up, because it connects the value discussion to something larger about what is actually happening to general aviation as a financial ecosystem. The way aircraft values are behaving right now, the specific categories that are falling hardest, and the specific reasons those categories are falling is actually very instructive about where the structural stresses in general aviation ownership economics are concentrated. The categories under the most pressure are overwhelmingly the ones where the combination of high insurance cost, significant maintenance complexity, sophisticated buyer demographics, and the availability of compelling alternatives has made the traditional ownership value proposition genuinely hard to justify for a meaningful share of the potential buyer pool. That is not a temporary market condition the way the interest rate environment might eventually normalize. It is a structural shift in how the economics of general aviation ownership pencil out for a large and growing share of people who have the money and the desire to fly, but are doing increasingly rigorous analysis of whether ownership is the right delivery mechanism for the flying they actually want to do. The categories that are holding value best in the current environment are the ones that have the clearest and most straightforward value proposition for a specific, identifiable mission. A basic, honest, well-maintained piston single with a sensible equipment list, reasonable insurance, predictable maintenance, and the ability to accomplish genuinely useful trips is holding up, because that value proposition is easy to articulate and easy to verify through ownership experience. The categories struggling are the ones where the buyer has to tell themselves a complicated story about why this specific airplane at this specific price makes sense for their mission, and where the alternative of not owning but accessing flying through a rental, a club, a fractional, or a charter arrangement has become genuinely more attractive relative to ownership cost than it used to be. That trend does not reverse overnight. It represents a slow shift in how the market is allocating the aviation dollar away from ownership of complex, expensive, high-friction assets and towards simpler ownership or access-based arrangements that deliver the flying without the overhead. For manufacturers, for dealers, for the maintenance ecosystem, and for everyone with a financial stake in the general aviation aircraft market, understanding where that shift is happening and how fast it is moving is not an academic exercise. It is the most important market intelligence question of the next decade, and the value signals we are watching right now in these specific categories are the clearest leading indicator we have of where that shift is accelerating and where it hasn't arrived yet. If you have been holding an airplane in one of the categories,